Hello again. Going to stick to the topic of time for this one. I'm just going to show you a different way of managing it. In the example file that I showed you at the start of the series, I actually didn't use timers at all. So I'm going to jump to the level class and show you a different way of manipulating or using or tracking time. I'm going to do it by counting frames. So I'm just going to start by making a variable here, make a protected variable, and we'll call it counter. And we'll make it an int. In the constructor we'll set it to 0, counter equals 0. And then in the looping function, in this every frame function here, I'm just going to increase the counter. So counter plus plus, and I'm going to trace it out. Trace counter. So while the game is running, while we're in the level, we should see a big trace streak. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Going and going. Just going to have to run it again to stop it. So we can see that we were getting ever increasing numbers traced out there. Every single frame, this counter is getting one bigger. And we could use the numbers generated in such a way to do meaningful stuff. So instead of, for example, instead of just spawning ships whenever there's less than so many children, we could spawn them after so many counts. So if I get rid of the trace and find the spawning function, maybe collapse a few of these ones that we're not actually looking at. Let's collapse that in. Oops. Just select the whole line. Two ships, we're not really interested in that one. Let's collapse it down. Far too much stuff in the way. Two bullets, don't need that. Do spawning, here we go. So at the moment we just spawn whenever there's less than 50 children on the screen, which isn't really game logic, it's barely even logic, it's just randomly spawning. Not even random, just continuously spawning until there's no more room. So instead of that, I'm going to change this if. I'm going to say if counter is greater than 300. We'll spawn a ship. We also need to be wary because, well, let me show you. If I do that and run it, as soon as counter gets above 300, we'll get a ship every frame, which isn't the desired result. 300 was probably a bad number to choose, but we'll get there eventually. There we go. And we start getting one every frame. So we need to reset the counter there. So we have to do counter equals 0. And just drop that to 30. So we should spawn a ship every 30 frames once the game's begun. Count 30 frames. Well, it's about a second. We're at 30 FPS. And that's working fairly well. So that's a better way to spawn. It's not ideal just yet, but it's manageable. Another way of doing this, instead of having to relying on our memory to reset this counter, we could use the modulus or modulo operator by putting a percentage sign and a number. And what that does, it gets the remainder of this number after dividing by this number. So for example, if counter was at 104, 104 modulo 100 would mean 4. So 104 modulo 100 would equal 4 because it chops the remainder off. Working with like your 2 times table, say 3 modulo 2 would be 1 because 3 divided by 2 is 1, remainder 1. 104 divided by 100 is 1, remainder 4. So we're left with the remainder. And we can use that in this logic here. So we could say if the remainder is 1, spawn a ship. So every 100 frames we'd spawn a ship without needing to... What have I done? Equals equals. So if the remainder is 1, we'll spawn a ship which basically means every 100 frames we get a new ship. After the 3-second wait, so 100 frames, we should get a new one. And 100 frames, we get another one. Yep. So that's working. And it also means lots of different logic can make use of the same variable. We don't have to reset it just for one property. So what I'm quickly going to do is add to the number of spawns by going up to the top and making a protected var num to spawn. That can be an integer, and we'll set that to 1 in here. So num to spawn equals 1. Start by spawning 1 ship at a time. Go back down to the spawning logic, and just before the spawn part we can say if counter modulo 200 num to spawn plus plus. So every 200 frames we'll spawn 1 extra ship per time. We're going to need to adjust this logic though to make sure that it uses that. So we're going to have a for loop here. We'll do for offer. I'm terrible at typing. It shows you don't need to be good at typing to be a programmer. Var I equals 0. I is less than num to spawn I plus plus. Close that after the end of the spawning logic. Thanks to whoever commented on one of my videos about this group tabbing. It saves a bit of time. Save it and test it. We should get 2 spawns, maybe 1 spawn on its own before we get a pair spawned, and then we'll get 2 pairs before 3 spawn, a pair of 3s, then a pair of 4s, and so on. We'll just get that. What did I do wrong there? Sorry, you need to actually check that the remainder equals 1. Do the most stupid things sometimes, never grow out of them. So this time we spawn 1, next time we spawn 2, the next time we'll spawn 2 again, the next time we'll spawn 3, the next time we'll spawn 3, and the next one will be 4, and so on. So by having this one counting variable, we can actually affect lots of different things. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Now it's not actually the way I did things in the final game. I had different variables because I wanted to manipulate them slightly differently. I wanted to have a haste for the ships, so they'd spawn at lower intervals, whereas at the moment they're just spawning every 100 frames. Totally fine for certain games. It definitely works in this instance. What else did I do? There are other ways of doing it. We could actually use a tween to do this, but it will mess up the logic a bit. Let's just do it with the num to spawn bit. So I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to make an empty tween up at the top to count some frames. So we'll do protected var. Just make sure tweens are imported here. I don't think they are. Copy all the tween stuff from the explosion. Copy that back to the level, paste in the imports, and we're going to make a tween. Num to spawn tween, we'll call it. Of type tween. In the constructor we'll set it going, so we'll do num to spawn tween equals new tween, and we won't actually tween anything. We're not making anything move, we're not affecting the property of anything. We're just going to put nothing there. We don't want to tween an object. So we're not going to be tweening a property. So the value really doesn't matter. 0 and 0 for the start and end. All that really matters is the time we take. I've missed something. We've got the easing function. So we don't want to ease, so I'll do non.ease none. Starting value of 0, ending value of 0, and the time is the only important thing. So every 200 frames we want to increase the num to spawn. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to make an event listener on it. So num to spawn tween dot add event listener tween event dot motion finish, and we'll add to spawn count, we'll call it. Just a different way of doing things here. It's not something I used in the final one. I just counted frames continuously. Didn't use any timers. Didn't do it with a tween. It's just good to see a different way to do it. So I'll do a function here. Protected function. Add to spawn count. Responding to a tween event. And I'm actually going to copy both of these lines. No, I'm not. I can just restart it. We'll do num to spawn ++ and num to spawn tween dot yo-yo to send it back so it plays again, basically. Let's save it and just test it to make sure that it's actually working. So every 200 frames we should start to get more spawns in one go. Take a drink while we wait. And you can see we got 2 spawn that time. 2 spawn again. The next one hopefully has 3, just to make sure it is a looping tween. There we go, we've got 3. 4 that time. You can see it's slightly out of sync with the counter. Not entirely sure why that is, but we've got a slightly different result using the tween than we did counting the frames. So again, another consideration for which way you go with it. You could do it a very messy way. Let's delete that. And instead of having one counter, get rid of these. Instead of having just the one counter, that could be spawn counter. And then we could have a num to spawn counter and do them and manage them both. So num to spawn counter equals 0 to start with. And when we update the counter, we'll update the num to spawn counter too. It's not called counter, is it? It's called spawn counter. Spawn counter ++ and num to spawn counter ++. Just go back to my constructor and change counter to spawn counter. And then in the spawning logic, instead of using counter, we'll use spawn counter, and we'll just above that we'll do the logic for the num to spawn counter. If num to spawn counter is greater than 200, num to spawn ++ num to spawn counter equals 0. And here we could get rid of that again. We could do greater than 100 spawn counter equals 0. Very basic logic we've gone back to, we're just doing it in different ways. I think this is the way I ended up doing it. I ended up breaking the game entirely. Num to spawn counter, not count. So by counting frames in two different variables, we can affect two different assets of the game, two different factors involved in the spawning. So we're getting 2 spawn that time. Probably get another shot of 2 spawning. Oh, we got straight to 3. 3 again. Next time probably be 4. There we go. It's kind of hard to tell when they spawn off the screen. Actually, with that in mind, just to make sure this isn't a complete waste of your time, let's change the spawn so that they do actually spawn off the screen. So we'll change this position. And to do that, we'll generate a random angle. So we'll do var rnd number equals math.random random times 2 times math.pi, because we're working in radians. And here we'll set the position of the ship to be on that angle but at a distance. So basically a random angle from the ship, from the turret outwards. So we'll do the player.x plus math.cos. I realise I still haven't gone through the maths. I will do it, I promise. RND times, and then a distance from the start. So let's say 300. Make all the ships spawn at least 300 pixels away. Well, exactly 300 pixels away at a random angle. We'll do the same for the y. Player.y plus math.sin this time. RND times 300. Test that, and we should notice that the ships spawn outside the screen this time. If we resize the video, you can see that they're spawning outside this green bounding box of the level. Well, that one didn't. Need to make the 300 bigger. And we're starting to get into the logic of the game. I am going to do a video specifically on gameplay, because really the gameplay is just reusing stuff you already know, so I'm not focusing on it at the moment. And as I always say, this video series isn't about the game you make, it's about understanding how. So that seems to be working. I'm just going to increase the 300 to 360. Save it. While we're here, just a couple of pointers. It's not the best idea to hard code numbers in like this. So what we could do, specifically with these spawn counters, we could put a constant in there. So we could have, for example, this could be spawn cooldown, no, spawn rate cooldown, and this one can be spawn cooldown. And up at the top where we declare everything, we make those constants. I did them in capital letters because that's just a good way to distinguish between variables and constants. So we've got spawn, need to make it const spawn rate in capitals equals 100, and const spawn I can't even think what it was now. Spawn rate and spawn cooldown and spawn rate cooldown. My memory is appalling. And I've got them backwards now. So that one's 100, this one's 200. Let's speed them up. We're just going to half them. Save it and test it. So the spawning should be twice as fast now. When the game actually starts, we've got the 3-second dead time, and then things start spawning, and now they're spawning a lot faster. And we're starting to get a game there. We have a score, we have a death when the ships finally overwhelm us. Let's see how long I can survive. I'm a terrible FPS player, so I'm not very good at aiming. Oh, there you go, I died. Died very quick because I'm shocking at this game. There we go, a little bit on counting frames. We will use that a lot more later on for some of the game logic when, for example, we increase the rate of the spawn based on how long you've been playing and various other bits. See you soon.